Our text for this morning is Acts chapter 24, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 21. That's on page 1128 in your Geneva Bible. Acts chapter 24, verses 1 through 21. Here we have the trial of Paul before the governor Felix. Acts chapter 24, verse 1. Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and with Tertullus, a certain orator which appeared before the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Seeing that we have obtained great quietness through thee, and that many worthy things are done unto this nation through thy providence, we acknowledge it wholly and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thanks. But that I be not tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy courtesy a few words. Certainly we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and the chief maintainer of the sect of the Nazarenes, and hath gone about to pollute the temple. Therefore we took him, and would have judged him according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to thee, of whom thou mayest, if thou wilt inquire, know all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews likewise affirmed, saying that it was so. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him that he should speak, answered, I do the more gladly answer for myself, forasmuch as I know that thou hast been oft many years a judge unto this nation, seeing that thou mayest know that there are but 12 days since I came up to worship in Jerusalem. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither making uproar among the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets, and have hope towards God that the resurrection of the dead, which they themselves look for also, shall be both of just and unjust. And herein I endeavor myself to have always a clear conscience towards God and toward men. Now after many years I came and brought alms to my nation and offerings, at what time certain Jews of Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been present before thee and accused me if they had aught against me. Or let these themselves say if they have found any unjust thing in me while I stood in the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, of the resurrection of the dead am I accused of you this day. The title of our message this morning, Acts chapter 24, verses 1 to 21. It's a court case. The Jewish state versus the Apostle Paul. It's a trial. Our introduction. In last week's text, Paul had been successfully transported in the middle of the night from Jerusalem toward Caesarea. You'll remember he was escorted by 470 Roman soldiers for the first at least 17 miles. And then the following day he was escorted by 70 riders on horseback the final 17 miles to the city of Caesarea, where he'll be tried in our morning's text. Here the Apostle Paul would endure another trial. His accusers would still be the Sanhedrin from Jerusalem, but this time he would be judged by the Roman governor, Felix. There are 2 points to our message this morning, verses 1 through 9. The Jewish state's case against Paul, as a prosecutor, and verses 10 through 21, Paul's defense against the Jewish state. This chapter contains Paul's third defense of the faith. Here in this text, he is formally accused by the Sanhedrin, who include the high priest and elders, through a lawyer named Tertullus. We'll read about that in verses 1 to 4. The charges given are of sedition, schism, and sacrilege, verses 5 and 6. Then the Jews complain against the chief captain, verses 7 through 9. Next, Paul defends himself. He begins by denying the charges, verses 10 through 13, and defines his real relationship to the Jewish church, verses 14 through 16. Paul closes by complaining of the absence of true witnesses and challenges those present to bring any legitimate charges against him, verses 17 through 21. We start with our first point, verses 1 to 9, the Jewish state's case against the Apostle Paul. Verse 1. Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders, and with Tertullus, a certain orator, which appeared before the governor against Paul. We learn here that a total of 5 days had passed since the time that Paul had arrived in Caesarea until the time that the Jews and their prosecuting attorney arrived in Caesarea for the trial. The advocate or lawyer here representing the Jewish nation is Tertullus. It is possible that this man was a Hellenistic Jew or even a Roman, a Gentile. The court most likely conducted its business in Latin, and the Jews may have needed an attorney that could speak Latin. He was hired as the lawyer of the Sanhedrin, which represented the religion of the entire Jewish nation. Verses 2 through 4. And when he is Tertullus, was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, Paul, saying, seeing that we have obtained great quietness through thee, Felix, and that many things are done unto this nation through thy providence, we acknowledge it wholly and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thanks. But that I be not tedious unto thee, I pray thee, that thou wouldest hear us of thy courtesy a few words. As you can see, it was customary that in court, during the opening remarks, there would be a time of praising, or in this case, overpraising, for the governor Felix presiding over the matter. Since Tertullus is representing the entire Jewish nation, his comments are directed to praising those rulings that have, in the past, benefited the Jewish nation. Tertullus praises the great quietness in Jerusalem, referring to the fact that Jerusalem had been kept from many wars, rebellions, and insurrections by the Romans. Of course, the Romans prided themselves in keeping the peace, and Tertullus notes that Rome was quick to discipline all those who threatened the Jewish church. Tertullus especially praises Rome's swift use of the military to destroy anything that disturbed the way of life for those associated with the temple. This compliment of swift judgment against those who troubled the church in the past foreshadows Tertullus's complaint that in this particular case, Rome has interfered with the Jews' right to judge Paul according to their own law. So it was good up until now, is what he's saying. Verse 5. Certainly we have found this man a pestilent fellow. That's, of course, talking about Paul. And a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. And a chief maintainer of the sect of the Nazarenes. In contrast here to the peace provided by Rome, Tertullus mentions Paul as a disturber of the Roman and Jewish peace. Tertullus calls Paul a pestilent fellow, meaning troublesome and mischievous. There are two immediate charges here made against the Apostle Paul. The first is that Paul is a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. And the second charge is that he is a chief maintainer of the sect of the Nazarenes, meaning the ringleader, the leader. The first charge is that of disturbing the peace among the Jews, both in Jerusalem and abroad, where other Jews are. The assumption is that anything that disturbs the Jews also disturbs the Romans, who were their guardians. The second charge is that Paul is the ringleader of the Nazarenes. Nazarenes here being a word used to describe Christians, quite likely because Jesus was from the city of Nazareth. Larger Catechism 145 warns us against such lies, stating the sins forbidden in the Ninth Commandment are all prejudicing the truth, especially in public judicature, that means court, church court, giving false evidence, suborning false witnesses, knowingly and appearing and pleading for an evil cause, concealing the truth, and equivocal expressions. That means to place doubt in somebody's mind so they don't really know the truth. Verse 6, and hath, this is Tertullus still speaking of Paul, charging Paul, and hath gone about to pollute the temple. Therefore we took him and would have judged him according to our law. In order to be more specific, Paul disturbed the peace when he attempted to allow a Gentile to enter its Jewish court, says Tertullus. When the riot started 8 days earlier, they were ready to kill Paul on the assumption that he had actually brought a Gentile into the court. Now the Jews have realized that this was not the case, and the charge is changed to that of attempting to pollute the temple. The phrase here, hath gone about, merely means that Paul had plans to pollute the temple. Had Paul actually brought the Gentile into the court, the Jews would not have been charging Paul with disturbing the peace, but with violating their sacred laws against temple sanctity. Now the profaning of the temple is simply used as an example of something that Paul was trying to do that disturbed the Jewish crowds. You notice they've changed the charge since the last trial. Verse 7, but the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him out of our hands. While Tertullus has brought 2 charges against Paul, he now makes an accusation of incompetence against the chief captain Lysias. When Tertullus argues that the chief captain Lysias came upon us, the literal translation of that Greek phrase, came upon us, suggests that it was as if Lysias incompetently happened to be walking by and by accident stumbled upon the riot. The misrepresentation of the actions of Lysias is intended to place doubt in the mind of Felix as to how well Lysias handled the situation. Lysias is presented as an incompetent who stumbled upon a problem and really had no idea how it should be properly fixed. Tertullus knew that hinting at a problem with Lysias would be more damaging than just revealing the facts that could be easily refuted. It must be remembered Lysias was not present at the trial and so could not defend himself if anyone told a lie about it. Tertullus uses this fact to manipulate the truth behind the riot. The second false complaint against Lysias was that with great violence Lysias took Paul out of their hands. This is a severe misrepresentation of the facts. The great violence that took place was the Jews beating Paul to death. And Lysias used lawful military power to save Paul, who was a Roman citizen, from being illegally beaten to death. Verse 8, Tertullus goes on, commanding his accusers to come to thee, of whom thou mayest, if thou wilt inquire, know all these things whereof we accuse him. The third complaint here against Lysias was that he had caused them, that is the Jewish Sanhedrin, a great inconvenience. The Jews believed that by their law they had the right to try Paul in their own courts. Remember, the Romans had given the Jews the right to the death penalty without Roman interference, only for the transgressing of the courts in the temple, of which this was a case. The Jews believed this crime was in their own jurisdiction, and the actions of Lysias had forced them to travel 34 miles to Caesarea. That's what it means by commanding his accusers to come to thee, in order to practice their own laws in a Roman court. The Jews call as witness to all these events Lysias, the chief captain. Tertullus tells Felix that if he will put this line of questions to Lysias, his testimony of the events will demonstrate the Jews had been wronged. Verse 9, and the Jews likewise affirmed, saying that it was so. The use of the term Jews here refers to the high priest Ananias and the elders who made up the presbytery in Jerusalem. It must be understood that this speech that was here recorded in verses 1 through 9 was, of course, not all the statements made by Tertullus. His prosecution of Paul probably took hours. These 9 verses are a summary of all that was said. The Greek word here for affirmed means that these church officials did more than just nodded their head in agreement. The term affirmed in the Greek refers to solemnly and formally declaring something to be true. It's more likely the Jews here are publicly testifying as witnesses to the charges by Tertullus that have been levied against Paul. We come to our second point, verses 10 through 21, Paul's defense now against the Jewish state. Verse 10. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him that he should speak, answered, I do the more gladly answer for myself, forasmuch as I know that thou hast been oft many years a judge unto this nation. It is Paul's primary intention to use this trial as another opportunity to show the biblical relationship between the law and the gospel, and the continuity of the teachings of Moses in the gospel of Christ. His secondary intention will be to defend himself, to prevent the unlawful taking of his own life. Paul does not extend the same amount of flattery towards Felix in his opening address, but simply acknowledges his competence to stand judge, since he's been a judge for 6 years. Verse 11, Paul speaking, seeing that thou mayest know that there are but 12 days since I came up to worship in Jerusalem. Paul begins to defend himself by giving his reasons for being in Jerusalem. Paul explains that he had only been in Jerusalem for 12 days. The first 7 days he was primarily in the temple, performing a vow, which hardly availed himself the time to cause the mayhem of which he was accused. The final 5 of those 12 days he was in prison. Paul claims the reason that he was in Jerusalem was to worship, and more importantly, to accommodate himself to the Jews. Verses 12 through 13, Paul continues his defense. And they neither found me in the temple, disputing with any man, neither making uproar among the people, neither in the synagogue, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. The next point of Paul's defense consisted in the direct denial of the charge of being a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition. Verse 5. He had been in Jerusalem for 12 days, and in that time no witness could be produced of Paul speaking publicly or in the church against the Jews or the temple. Paul had in fact spent the first 7 days performing a Nazirite vow that the church in Jerusalem had asked of him, which involved paying a large sum of money and shaving his head. Paul had neither the opportunity of doing what the Jews alleged against him, nor had done what they accused him of at all. Therefore, the charges, argues Paul, are false and not provable. Verse 14, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way, which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law of the prophets. After answering the first charge of being a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition, Paul now moves to answering the second charge, which is that of being a chief maintainer or a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Paul says nothing about being the ringleader of all Christians or Nazarenes, but he does acknowledge and confess to being called a Nazarene and being a follower of Christ. However, Paul argues just because he belongs to Christianity does not mean he is guilty of apostasy against the laws of Moses. Paul argues that when he worships Christ, he does not worship a new God, but the same one who had been worshipped by his fathers. Christianity, argues Paul, was the genuine continuation and completion of Old Testament Judaism. Paul says, they charged me with worshiping some strange god, but the very God whom I worship is our own ancestral God. And this can be proved according to the Old Testament law and prophets, which showed forth Christ's gospel and is the foundation of the once Jewish but now Christian church. Verse 15, Paul continues, and have hope towards God that the resurrection of the dead, which they themselves look for also, shall be both of just and unjust. Paul argues that if he worships the same God and believes in the same sacred books of the Old Testament, how could he be an apostate? Paul argues that all those who read the Old Testament knew of its one major theme, which was the hope of the coming of a Messiah. Connected to the hope of that Messiah was the resurrection of the dead. Paul mentions this resurrection would occur for both the just and the unjust for the sake of the heathen present. Paul wanted them to know that they too needed a Messiah. Concisely, Paul's argument was that they practiced one and the same religion because they were joined by one God, one Scripture, and one Messiah. Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 33, section 3, teaches concerning the resurrection that the bodies of the unjust shall, by the power of Christ, be raised to dishonor. The bodies of the just, by his Spirit, unto honor, and be made conformable to his own glorious body. Verse 16, Paul continues, and herein I endeavor myself to have always a clear conscience toward God and toward men. Paul says that this adherence to God, the Scriptures, and the Messiah was the source of Paul's endeavor. Endeavor means his hard work, his labor, and his moral code, which he gained by systematic, methodical, and habitual effort. That's what he means by endeavor, what he was working towards. Paul says that he possesses a clear conscience towards God and towards men. In Greek, this phrase, a clear conscience, is a single word, which means void of offense, which suggests two ideas, that Paul was unoffended and unoffending. Paul's was a conscience that was not wounded by his own conduct and was therefore cleared towards God. Nor did Paul allow his gospel or conduct to lead others away from God, and therefore his conscience was clear towards men. Verses 17 and 18. Now after many years I came and brought alms to my nation in offering. At what time certain Jews of Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. In these final verses, Paul now returns to explain the reason he came to Jerusalem, and in doing so to defend the charge that he was a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. Paul says he had not come to disturb the Jews, but to worship their common God, and to bring alms to, notice, my nation, and offerings. Paul had been following the temple purification ritual, which was part of the sacrificial system. Paul had also collected funds from the Greek churches for years, and now he brought those funds to my nation, he says, meaning the Jews. Paul asks, how could he have defiled the temple and divided the people when he brought relief to the many poor among them, and also while he was in the midst of offering sacrifices according to the Jewish customs at the very sanctuary in which he was said to have profaned? Paul was in the very act of showing his devotion to the Mosaic law when he was taken prisoner. Paul says he was doing this privately. That's what we mean by neither with multitude. And neither was he bringing a Gentile into this court to cause trouble. That's why he said, I wasn't doing this nor with tumult. Yet Paul was taken and charged with profaning the temple. Verse 19, who ought to have been present before thee and accused me if they had aught against me. Now you might remember it was not the Jews of Jerusalem that had started all this trouble. It was the Jews from Asia Minor who started the riot. Since it was the Asiatic Jews who started the riot and made all these original accusations against Paul, why were they not present to accuse Paul? In other words, Paul asks why he must stand on trial before Jerusalem Jews as my accusers when they were not the ones to bring the original charge. The original charge was brought by the Jews of Asia Minor. And therefore, says Paul, this proceeding was without sound law, for it did not provide eyewitnesses, but only those who took up the cause of the Asian Jews. And finally, verses 20 and 21. Or let these themselves, that means the Asian Jews, the Jerusalem Jews, themselves say, if they have found any unjust thing in me while I stood in the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, of the resurrection of the dead, am I accused of you this day. Paul argues that since the original accusers are not present, the charge of sedition must be dropped, as well as the charge of profaning the temple. Furthermore, the Jews already tried him once, but found him guilty of nothing. Paul now explains that since there were no grounds for prosecuting him on these 2 points, then he must be released. Unless, of course, the Jews would like to make up some more false charges. Paul concludes by asking the Jerusalem Jews if they would like to charge him with something that they themselves personally witnessed. Paul ends by saying that the only charge that he knows of that the Jerusalem Jews might make is against his belief in the resurrection of the dead. This, we all know, was really the issue all along. All the rest was a deliberate diversion. It all came back to whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. And if he was, did he rise from the dead? And will those who believe in him also rise from the dead to be with him? Paul was really being tried for his belief that Christ was the fulfillment of the laws of Moses, the Jewish religion, and the promised Messiah written of in the Old Testament. That's really what this trial is about. Let us pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, we do pray that you might give us clearness of mind, a greater understanding of this particular text of the Scriptures, that we might apply those things unto our lives, the faults that we have seen, those things that have been done well, that we might be encouraged to imitate. Father, we do pray that the Scriptures would serve to us as an amendment of life, that we might put away those sins and those wicked deeds, and that we might have proper thoughts towards the law, have a greater understanding of the law, that we might please thee more. We do pray these things in thy Son's name. Amen. We come to our final psalm, Psalms 132, verses 9 through 14. Psalm 132, verses 9 through 14. Psalm 132, verses 9 through 14. Let thy priests be clothed